And now, ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause for our esteemed speakers to please come up on stage. Mr. Edmund Lin?
Yeah.
The stage is yours.
We got one more. Okay. Good morning. Good morning. We're going to get this one going if that's okay. Before we get started, I've got the privilege of introducing our esteemed panelists. We're quite fortunate today to have quite a great lineup. To my right, Erik Berglöf, who's the chief economist of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Next to him is the distinguished Nicholas Moore. He's the former chief executive of Macquarie Group Limited. After retiring from Macquarie, he's taken on a very important role as Australia's special envoy for Southeast Asia. We've already had an early introduction of our next panelists, the esteemed Honorable Mary Ng. She is a globally respected voice on international trade, inclusive economic growth, and business leadership. As I think you all know, from 2018 to 2025, she served as Canada's Minister of International Trade, Export Promotion, Small Business, and Economic Development. She was the country's longest-serving trade minister. Very importantly, we have our old friend, Dr. Raden Pardede. I think he needs no introduction, but for those of you that don't know, he's had a very distinguished career as a senior economist. For the last 30 over years, he's been a special advisor, chief advisor to the Ministry of Finance and the coordinating Minister of Economic Affairs. He serves on many boards, including that of the most successful bank in Indonesia, Bank of Central Asia. We also have Jens Arnold. Jens is the head of division for Southeast Asia for OECD's economic department, and prior to that, and he joined OECD in 2006. He's worked on a wide range of issues. This panel is outstanding. It's a very important topic, inclusive growth in a volatile world. And I'd like to just reiterate some of the themes that we heard this morning through the dialogue. Geopolitical tensions are rising. Global supply chains are shifting. Economic growth is simply becoming harder to sustain. And frankly, it's leaving many behind. Now, as countries compete for capital, for technology and influence, we're here to discuss how growth can remain open, fair, and inclusive in a very volatile world. So I'd like to kick things off. Erik, maybe for you to start. If our global economy needs to be more inclusive, how would you achieve that? What are some of the biggest priorities?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting event. So I think, first of all, we should remind ourselves where we are. We are in really the growth center of the global economy for the last 10 years. More than half of global growth has come from Asia. We are also, and that has come by more and more countries coming into global value chains and joining international production arrangements. We have also seen a lot of people, millions of people, being brought out of poverty. So the story is good, and there is much more scope for integration in this region, and that will help growth. We are also in the region that is most affected by climate change and nature loss. So really the global battle against climate change and nature loss will be won or lost in Asia. So again, this is absolutely a critical place to think about the future of the world. And for us as an infrastructure investment bank, obviously infrastructure is at the core of this. It is infrastructure that connects people, connects countries, that the more access we have to infrastructure, the greater is the economic value of infrastructure. Also the financial returns are affected by how many have access to this infrastructure. But infrastructure is also something that we have to be very careful when we put in place, because it locks us in for decades. And if we get it wrong now, we will have to live with that for a very long time. So we are at the core of this transformation as well here in Asia. So I think of this inclusive world in two ways. We talk about sort of horizontal inclusion, including more and more countries. This part of the world has been extremely successful in allowing more countries and more countries joining more global value chains. It's part of a global trend, shifting global value chains from the advanced economies to the emerging world, and Asia has very much been leading that process. It went through some very severe shocks. We had COVID, we have the current geopolitics. I think what we know, yes, these value chains were affected, but they've come out, I would argue, even more resilient and not that much affected, maybe lengthened a little bit. Some new countries have seen opportunities, but it's been a very good journey. And what we can see now also is that these global value chains are really the engine of this transformation that I described. Every lead firm in this value chains will have to think about how they can transform their value chains and the different participants in that chain. And every single investment almost is about infrastructure, either about green power, green transport, about clean water, and it's about digital infrastructure. But it's also about nature as infrastructure, that nature is the most important infrastructure that we have. And by treating it as infrastructure, we have a lot of tools from infrastructure finance that we can use, and both in terms of how we integrate public and private interests, and how we use public interest to try to reduce the risk. So again, for us, infrastructure is at the core. Inclusion doesn't come automatic from infrastructure. You have to be very careful in your design and in how you implement it and how you produce outcomes. These are the deliberate choices, and this is what MDBs can help with pushing that agenda. Thank you.
Super. Erik, thank you. I think we can all resonate with those messages. Nicholas, could you share your perspectives on the same question?
Certainly, Edmund. I'm coming in as a business person, of course, so I don't have. I'm not an economist. That said, I think, and so I will always be biased to optimism, but I think there's quite a lot of numbers to support the optimism. If we look at growth, obviously, since 1961, the world's grown at 3.7%, relatively predictably. Last year, notwithstanding what we've seen on the screen and what we read every day, the world still grew at 3.2%. So 3.7 average, 3.2 substantial, and obviously over the last 20 years, the world has doubled in size. So in absolute terms, that means twice as much growth as we're seeing. So I think it's really important to have a perspective, and the world is robust. From the point of view of supply chains, as we've just heard, they are also very flexible. And one of the things we saw in Australia when we had a major disruption with our major trade partner, China, our GDP didn't miss a beat. The exports, the trade was rerouted. The world is very robust, and so we should never lose sight of the robustness of the world. And coming back to the point about what that means from an inclusive viewpoint, obviously we've seen a dramatic reduction in people living in absolute poverty around the world. It's, again, over that time period, we've seen it go from 1.7 billion to 800 billion. So 1 billion people have left poverty over this period, which is remarkable. That's sort of averaging, more than 50,000 people a day. And that's happening here in this region, as mentioned, and actually here in Indonesia, we're seeing 500,000 people leaving poverty annually. So I think it's really important to have the big perspective to see how robust world growth is. Yes, there are challenges, and we should minimise those challenges, and we should address them, but we should address them from the point of view of a degree of confidence that we can find our way through it. The second element in terms of how to achieve it, inclusive growth. I think it really does depend on each society, each country making their own decisions and working out the appropriate mix for the government and the private sector that works for them. And I don't necessarily think there's one size that fits all. It's a question of dealing with the needs of the needs of the society at the time.
Nicholas, thank you. I think the notion that this is not cut-paste across economies really resonates with all of us. Mary, I know this is an area of particular interest for you in your previous and current capacity.
Well, thank you for this. And inclusive growth and partnerships is probably something that goes hand in hand. We were very intentional over the last number of years, and even more so now, with creating more trading relationships around the world for Canada. Canada sits next to a very large neighbor who also happens to be our largest trading partner in the United States. So that relationship is always going to be important because of how integrated our supply chains are and how integrated our economy is. But for some of you who may have heard what the Prime Minister of Canada just talked about, that there is a rupture today in the global economy, and we as Canadians were probably one of the first to see it and needed to think about what it is that we need to do in order to determine what is best for Canada's economic future. I, as the Trade Minister, have never not had diversification in my mandate. And I think one of the things that stand out really well for Canada is the trade architectures that we have literally around the world. Having access to about 65% of the global economy. We're in agreements like the CPTPP, we're with Australia and Japan and Singapore and many others. It's really terrific that we concluded a really robust and excellent trade agreement with Canada and Indonesia, and we're at the negotiating table with ASEAN, and we also are robust trading partners with the European Union. So I think to answer the question around inclusiveness, I think it's two things. I think it's one, making sure that you have the kinds of trading relationships with many partners around the world, and today in particular, those that provide the certainty and the predictability that your businesses and your people are looking for. That is what our people are looking for, and I think as countries like Canada and Indonesia and Australia and so many others, I think we could do that together, and I think we can pursue that objective of predictability and creating the conditions for our businesses and our investors to do business. And I think the second point around inclusiveness has been something that has been at the very core of my work, certainly, and our work, and that is making sure that we have as many people in the economy as we possibly can. Here I'm talking about micro, small, and medium-sized businesses, women-led enterprises. Just to give you a statistic around that, adding more women into the Canadian economy will add $150 billion to our economy. If we did that globally, it's $12 trillion to the economy. So I think that we can work and keep working on that and don't lose sight of the work that is needed to truly make our economies inclusive. But inclusion just simply means it is stronger economies around partners who care about our ability to advance a rules-based infrastructure that we all can and should continue to promote and work towards.
Mary, thank you. I think that second point in particular, to talk not just about selfless action, but actual structural, massive economic impact, I think that is really the right framing. Dr. Raden, I know this has been near and dear to your heart, this topic of building an Indonesian economy that is more inclusive. It alludes to some of the comments from Minister earlier. Maybe you could share your perspectives, please.
Thank you. First of all, I think we understand the challenge that we face right now. I mean, despite all the challenge, especially when we talk about this global tension and everything, right? I still believe about the global partnership, as Mary already mentioned. I think this is good. I mean, among us, we need to continue to have this partnership among us. At the same time, I agree that we cannot just talk about the growth without inclusive. In terms of growth itself, Indonesia is not bad at all, around 5%, as you already hear from the coordinating Minister of Economic Affairs. Over the last 25 years, Indonesia has been 5%. But the problem, 5% is not enough for us. That's one problem. But even more important, growth per se is not enough. We need to have more inclusive. I think you already see the numbers before that Gini coefficient in Indonesia is declined, which has now become 0.375. Is quite okay compared to many other countries. But I think we still need to do a lot of things, including things related to the inclusiveness here, including related to the population itself. And second is the regional. You know, Indonesia, of course, is very diverse. We need to think about this one as well. We need to have some initiative for this one. And of course, as you mentioned clearly about the gender parity as well, this is also very close to our mind in Indonesia. And the middle class, in my view, is the most important one for Indonesia. If we can just expand the number of the middle class in Indonesia, I mean, since the population is big, right, 200, I don't know, close to 290 now, and the middle class is, I think, is the most important one to expand continuously. Because if we have a strong middle class, then that's the purchasing power come from there. So to have it, basically, at the same time, of course, we need to address this low-income group, to address the poverty at the same time. So we have several key initiatives right now in Indonesia, key strategies, including how to accelerate the formalizations in the economy, which is, you know, in Indonesia now is still quite significant numbers of small and informal sectors, informal micro enterprise. So by raising the individual income, we need to transitioning this worker from informal sector to become a formal sector. Meaning the formal sector, of course, we expect they will have a higher income, higher benefit, and more stability. That, I think, will ensure the stability of the economy in the future. And the second one is we need to increase significantly the number of medium and large enterprise to create productivity. I already do some study. If we continue to rely on the micro and small enterprise, basically it is quite difficult to improve the well-being and the prosperity of the populations. And of course, enhance regulatory quality. This is one of the most important one. Yeah? Improving the business environment, I think this is a homework of our government as well as all of us in Indonesia. Boosting labor productivity is another important pillar in my view. Of course, by improving the training, education, and also we have to involve in the research. We cannot continue to be a commodity-dependent economy. As we know, the commodity itself at the end will be depleted, especially non-renewable commodities, eventually will be depleted. So we need to go further. As the minister mentioned about go to the more innovative, innovation-led growth in the future, including the semiconductor, electronics, and others. And of course, with that, we need to improve the infrastructure and also digitalizations. And others, of course, broadening. This is another important point in Indonesia now, is broadening the fiscal and also the social base. Tax reform is a very important one for Indonesia. You know, the tax ratio in Indonesia is among the lowest in the world, probably, only 9.3%. Without improving the tax base, without improving the revenue of the government, how can the government participate in these many programs that I already mentioned before? So we need to have this one as well. And of course, the most important one, I think, is partnership with the private sector. The government alone cannot solve this problem. Because the government itself, as I mentioned about the tax base in Indonesia, is so limited. So we need to use the resources that have by this private sector. So the partnership between the government and the private sectors is become very important. Last but not least, of course, the stability, even more important than ever, than many other things. So stability, I think, has become very important in order to have sustainable growth in the future. Thank you.
Raden, thank you. I think if I go back to what Nicholas was saying earlier about how this needs to be quite customized to every individual country, I think this quite thoughtful, visionary, whole of sector view, ranging from small industries to kind of medium and large, public-private partnerships, full value chain of education, et cetera. Incredibly thoughtful, really appreciate it. Jens, let me turn to you with the same question. I think our friends here in the audience would really benefit from the OECD perspectives that you bring.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Edmund. It's a pleasure to be here, and at the OECD we are of course very happy to see that Indonesia has submitted its initial memorandum in its process towards accession to the OECD, and we are very much looking forward to welcoming Indonesia in the OECD family in the future. So when we talk about inclusive growth, I think the important thing is to first recognize that we are actually talking about growth here. No, I mean, growth is really the important thing for future progress in material living standards. And so how do you sustain growth, particularly in a situation where demographics are slowly turning against us, where the population is aging, where you will no longer be able to replicate the kind of growth dividend that you had from an ever-growing workforce that you've had in the past, no? So what does that mean? Well, it inevitably means that productivity growth will have to play a much larger role in the future, no? And how do you do that? Well, I mean, this region has been very successful in merchandise exports. It's been a great success story. Indonesia certainly is a great example of that. It has attracted FDI, it has strengthened its institutions, improved its regulations, but at the same time the growth ambitions are very high. So how do you take this next step? No, and I think there, one important thing to bring to the picture is what happens not only in manufacturing, but also what happens in the services sector. No? And there we see that Southeast Asia and Indonesia also has been much more reticent to open up to competition, to reap the benefits from competition that many other countries and many other economies in the world have reaped. No? And at the OECD, we have, for example, a way of measuring policy stances and measuring how competition-friendly regulatory policies and services sectors are. And that's where Indonesia, for example, still has significant room for improvement in the future. No? And this is very important because services matter not only for services itself, but they really matter for the entire economy. There's hardly any manufacturing enterprise that wouldn't be reliant on essential services. So services are really one of the determinants of competitiveness in the future. No? And then a second question, when we come back to the inclusive growth question, is how do you make this growth more inclusive? How do you spread the fruits better, into the wider population? And there, of course, the first thing to think about is, as an economy grows, there will be more and more labor market opportunities, there will be better jobs available. And in the long run, how do you get people into these good jobs? Well, it's all about education, it's about skills, it's about getting the right vocational training to the people, including in the tertiary level of education. But that takes time, of course, no? And so in the shorter run, you also have other policy instruments. For example, improving your social protection systems, no? And this is something where Southeast Asia, and particularly Indonesia, also still has significant scope for progress. Of course, when you look at only the indicators, you look at the poverty indicators, poverty has declined massively, and that is a huge improvement for Indonesia. But when you look at, for example, the coverage of social protection, you see that 88% of the working age population in Indonesia today will not have an old age pension in the future when they retire. So this is a huge challenge, particularly in a context where we know that the share of the elderly population is set to double between now and 2050, and at the same time, the number of people in working age will pretty much halve around the same time. So, this is a huge challenge. How do you bring this forward? And you know, it creates challenges for the future design of social protection, particularly when you think about this large informal sector that was mentioned here. You know, you have a lot of people who are not contributing to the pension system, who will not get any benefits from a contributory pension in the future. So you have to think about alternative ways of supporting these people when they reach old age. And at the OECD, we've been pushing the idea of, you know, multi-tiered social protection systems where you have a basic tax-based, non-contributory pension that delivers some kind of benefits for people in beyond the pension age, and that at the same time ensures that you don't create the wrong incentives, because if you have contributions that are too high and you have close to 70% of the workforce in the informal sector right now, you know, if the price of joining the formal sector is too high, you will have less and less people joining the formal sector. So it's very important to think about, you know, getting the incentives right, and non-contributory benefits are probably an important ingredient of that. And of course, we have to be very aware of the scarce fiscal resources. You know, as you rightly said, Indonesia has a very low tax to GDP ratio. That will have to improve and increase in the future. But while you're working on that, it's of course very important to make best use of the resources that are currently available. And for that, I think the question of targeting social benefits is very important. Make sure that your benefits reach those that are really in need. That is a challenge for the future design of social protection, but it is also a challenge already for some of the large programs that are going on in Indonesia. So I think this question of targeting well your scarce resources, that's an important part of the agenda.
Jens, thank you. Thank you so much. Let me shift gears. Mary, if I could turn to you. Minister called this out. One of your many, many achievements in the previous role was the signing of the Indonesia-Canada Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreements. Maybe you could share a little bit more of your perspectives on the impact this is having and frankly will have in future on inclusive growth. And, you know, could this be a model for future bilateral agreements with other Asian markets in Canada?
Yeah. It was really great to hear and to see my colleague, Pakar Langa, the minister, and he was right. We both were very committed to putting the pedal to the metal, as they say, on the Canada-Indonesia Free Trade Agreement, or the CEPA that is known here. It's really important for Canada because we're 40 million people, so we're a fraction of what Indonesia is. We're the 10th largest economy in the world. And we're also at the negotiating table with the ASEAN as a multilateral agreement. And of course, many of those who are in the ASEAN already a part of the CPTPP. So for Canada, it was really important to make sure that we continue to build out this architecture and have partners, economic partners, trading partners that actually create this sort of network of predictable, stable partners where we could work with each other to, you know, to build our economies. There are synergies between Canada and Indonesia. Canada has a robust mining sector. Critical minerals is what I think all of us today are working on. On skills and development, education, and the ability to share and develop partnerships with Indonesia is a real opportunity. In areas of AI or technology, other areas of opportunities for growth. So the trade agreement is really just simply an architecture. I often say that the agreement is really just the beginning of the work, because I think you'll hear from our colleague here from Australia that really the rubber hits the road when businesses begin to do that kind of collaboration, to invest and to partner with each other, and that's where we're at now, and I think that is very much the work that is needed, and I think it's variable geometry, which is the phrase that Prime Minister Carney used, which is let's be practical and let's be principled. Let's have trade architectures that have integrity and that have the rules that are needed, but let's also be practical with the kinds of investments that we're going to need across the many sectors of our economies that can work here, and certainly in Indonesia, but also with others who are in the region, and where we can find those synergies is going to be what I hope we're going to count on our private sectors to be doing in Canada and Indonesia, and indeed across our partners.
Super. On that note, maybe Nicholas, if we could turn to you. I think in your role, you've taken a very creative, a very pragmatic approach of engaging bottom up, if you will, leaders in Australian business to promote relationships and investments in specific countries. Maybe you could expand upon some of the approaches you've had.
Certainly. So it's been a very conscious policy of our government, starting from a business viewpoint in 22. So Australia and Indonesia have a long-standing, very strong government-to-government relationship from a security viewpoint, from a development viewpoint, and that's only strengthened in recent years. So very good high-level development. But in 22, when the new government came in, the Prime Minister looked at the relationship. He said it's very good government to government, but from a business viewpoint, Australian businesses have been looking more to the Northern Hemisphere, shall we say, to the US, to North Asia, to Europe, than to the neighbourhood. And his view very clearly is the most important relationship Australia has internationally is with Indonesia. So basically he commissioned a report and a whole range of actions trying to actually get the business community to engage far more with Indonesia and the neighbouring countries. And so to that end, today we have in the audience here 28 members of a delegation, an investment delegation. We have in Jakarta today the 5th delegation we've had since this initiative. This is an investment delegation. Australia has a very large institutional pension fund base, about 4.5 trillion Australian dollars, growing to 9 trillion. Indonesia has to be a substantial target for that. We've got a very strong corporate sector as well, and again the corporate sector is very active. Talking about the CEPA agreement, we entered into one in Indonesia, with Indonesia 5 years ago. Our trade has increased 3 times since then. So we're seeing the concrete stepping up of trade, stepping up of engagement, and the government is not only relying upon increased awareness, it's actually leaning in as well, providing financing facilities for Australian companies to invest here in Indonesia. It's actually putting people on the ground here. We've got deal teams across Indonesia looking at opportunities for Australian businesses, very much focused on the Indonesian government's identified needs in terms of capability building, resources, as we've talked about before, energy, these critical areas. People on the ground are working with the government departments, with Australian businesses, bringing the two together. And we're already seeing an impact in terms of increased investment. As I mentioned, trade has stepped up a lot. And we're very optimistic in terms of where the relationship is going as a result of the government really supporting the private sector in terms of what's possible here. With the underlying story, of course, as we've heard, underlying growth here, 5%, 8%, somewhere between that going forward. Very substantial country, very important neighbour for Australia.
Nicholas, I appreciate this. It's very encouraging to hear you and Mary talk about two middle powers and the progress that's been made. I'm going to open the aperture a little bit more and point to you, Dr. Raden. In this context, maybe 2 questions. Do you still believe in the value of global cooperation and partnerships? And second, in that context, how do you see the role and positioning of Asia and Indonesia in particular within the evolving global landscape?
Thank you. I think, as I mentioned before, I still believe that the global partnership is very important. Of course, we understand the reality that we face right now, especially between the great power. But I think this is one of a good example that we see from the current development. Let's say when we have the tariff, right, from Mr. Trump, right? But suddenly everything's become accelerated, especially related to the CEPA. So we signed agreement with Canada, as Mary, of course, contribute a lot to this signing of the CEPA. And of course, with EU CEPA also, now is underway in good progress, and Eurasia. And just recently, I think we signed a pre-CEPA with UK. What I'm saying here is everybody kind of back to reality that we cannot rely continuously on the great power itself, right? I mean, that's a good news. I mean, this is why I think that, again, Indonesia will continue to play, and I believe that the global partnership is very important for Indonesia. And of course, again, Indonesia, as we know, is the third largest democracy and also the largest archipelago state in the world right now, will continue to play a geopolitical bridge and a diplomatic mediator, as Minister mentions. Probably we call Indonesia pursue a pre and active, but now it seems to me that our president is not only pre, but proactive, right? So it's two different things. We have to be more proactive instead of just active now, which is we try positioning itself in the neutral intermediaries, especially between the great power US and China. And of course, we use the ASEAN centrality framework. I mean, Indonesia and ASEAN, I think it's very important to continue this framework. And with ASEAN as a big population, big countries in terms of economy, then we have more leverage compared if we just do it alone, right? And of course, Indonesia is, look at the strategic expansion of Indonesia to the OECD. At the same time, also we apply for BRICS. Again, this is just kind of to balance. I mean, of course, I agree that Indonesia is very important to go to the OECD, because by a member of OECD, meaning that we also improve our standards. Our standards have to be a more advanced country, a more advanced economy. All the standards related to the business climate and everything have to be that standard. But at the same time, we need to continue to grow ourselves. Without domestic economic performance continuously, then we cannot play in this middle power, as we call the middle power. UN peacekeeping, one of the most important one that I can tell the audience here, Indonesia always participated in the UN peacekeeping. Indonesia is the leading contributor to UN peacekeeping operations. And even when we have recently the Gaza, Indonesia is one of the first countries that offered the soldiers participate in the UN US keeping. So I think with several that I already explained to you, Indonesia again value the global partnership is very important, and Indonesia would like to continue to play at least as a middle power, of course. At the same time, we need to continue to also to improve our domestic powerhouse. Thank you.
Dr. Raden, thank you. I think that is a perfect way to wrap this up, where you've provided both kind of the macro perspective. You've gone very deep here in thankfully, our host country in Indonesia to share those perspectives. What a diverse panel. I think the thoughts that were shared across so many different dimensions on the prospects of inclusive growth in an increasingly volatile environment, I hope, like the six of us on stage, there are some green shoots of optimism that come from this discussion. I'd like to thank the organizers and, most importantly, thank each of our panelists for sharing their views. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our moderator and our esteemed speakers. Please give a round of applause once again. And we kindly invite you to please take a step forward to receive a token of appreciation presented by the Indonesian Business Council. And to present the token of appreciation, we'd like to invite onto the stage the CEO of the Indonesian Business Council, Bapak Sofyan Jalil. We'd like to invite to our moderator and to our esteemed speakers to please take a position on stage to receive the token of appreciation presented by the Indonesian Business Council. And now we invite you to please take a group photo on stage to commemorate this moment. Thank you, Bapak Sofian Jalil, and thank you to our moderator and of course our panelists, our speakers for the first plenary session.